Meanwhile, a new study commissioned by Visa reveals a rise in consumer awareness and proactive security measures for digital payments across Central and Eastern Europe, the Middle East and Africa. With a rapidly evolving digital payments landscape, consumers are embracing its convenience while becoming more vigilant about security. Visa's global chief economist, Wayne Bester, joins us now to unpack the findings in greater detail. Thank you so much for your time, Wayne. Now, as a global payments company, just speak on the health of the consumer at this point. I mean, this is a consumer that has been put through the ringer by elevated inflation and interest rates.
Yes, we looked at kind of the global picture first in terms of what is happening with the consumer. And frankly, they're holding up. They're continuing to spend and yes, being challenged, as you mentioned, by higher interest rates and inflation. But and we saw a little bit of a slowdown last year as a result of those issues. But boy, when we look towards the end and leveraged one of our tools, the Spending Momentum Index, what we saw is that, for every country that we follow that was rising, two of them were declining. So that's a momentum of more people out there spending, which really is, frankly, the key driver of consumer spending as we see it.
I'm actually wondering if there's an actual structural change in the financial situation of the consumer, or at this point, if it is just a sentiment, of course, seeing the figures of inflation coming down and also interest rates, but also keeping in mind that interest rates haven't really been falling as aggressively as we had wanted them. There's a shallow interest rate cutting cycle at this point.
Yeah, I agree. I think the inflation picture is really very paramount here, and it is starting to come down, especially in the area of goods.
Yeah.
We see that inflation picture. Services still very much elevated. Service inflation is very much driven by wages, and as wages have been holding up relatively well, we see that impact in terms of the service sector. But for example, we looked at household furnishings, and you look at it around the world, it's going down pretty substantially. I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with the supply chains that created a lot of those problems have now been fully corrected. And we've also balanced the amount of spending that we're doing overall. So not everybody's out buying a couch at the same time, like we did in COVID when we couldn't travel anywhere.
Well, that's the thing. Not a lot of people are buying couches. I was actually at a conference that a bank held recently, and the chief economist actually said that people actually want experiences now. They're not really buying actual goods. Is that maybe what we're seeing, and also maybe what is informing the still kind of elevated inflation that we have in services?
I think that, yeah, obviously the demand factor is very prevalent, and we'll get into some travel trends in a moment. But, I think if you look at the global picture of spending, yes, there are pockets, there are macroeconomic differences. We know that in food inflation is high in Nigeria and in Egypt, 40 and 20% respectively. I mean, those are challenges for those consumers. They're just not going to be able to buy as many discretionary items like travel and other experiences, as you mentioned, with those types of rates. But that said, we are starting to see the corner turn on interest rates specifically. If I look across all of the central banks in the world, there's about 64 of them. Last year, 3 out of 4 actually had a lower interest rate than they did at the start of the year.
Okay.
Now, still we had 1 out of 4 that didn't, out of 64, as I mentioned, in terms of the math. But what's interesting there is that we have more of that momentum of further interest rate reductions. That plays importantly when we start thinking about the financial institutions and their willingness to lend. The Senior Loan Officer Survey across 39 countries showed that their banks are very close to getting back to willing to lend much more readily because, the interest rate picture has changed quite noticeably. And that's certainly very positive as I see it as we move on into 2025.
Yeah. You spoke about travel shifts that we have seen. Talk to me about those because, for example, I'd really love to go to the French Alps, but I think what I can afford right now is just a holiday here in Johannesburg.
Yeah, travel trends have been quite robust. Certainly this region, parts of this region have really taken off, especially after COVID. And there's a variety of reasons behind that. One of them is it's just easier to get in. Some countries have made
Okay.
their visa policies much easier. You can do a visa on demand or on arrival, and consumers certainly notice that. If it's
Hmm.
less friction in the system, then people will travel to those particular locations.
Yeah.
If I look at the actual hard data, for example, in the Middle East, occupancy rates last year in hotels were about 76% or so.
Hmm.
Whereas, in South Africa, it was still a respectable 66%. If
Okay.
I look at tourist arrivals into the Middle East, it was around 30%. So a
Hmm.
30% increase in tourist arrivals into the Middle East over last year. South Africa at 6%. Now that sounds like a big reduction, right?
Yeah.
But that's still the second largest growth rate in tourist arrivals across all the
Oh.
regions. So
Yeah.
that's a very positive item with regards to travel. And we're seeing that robustness happen. Now, some of the reasons also include a little weaker currency and those types of things, making it attractive. We're in Cape Town right now, and
Yeah.
certainly that's reflective. And frankly, it's pretty darn crowded here overall.
Uh-huh.
But as I dig into the travel trends, there's two other big things that I see happening right now.
Hmm.
And one of them is related to what we call slow travel. The world is starting to experience and see travel start to slow down in a good way. Here's
Okay.
what I mean. When I talk about slow travel, our research showed that people are end up staying longer at the location of when they do travel than they did before. In South
Hmm.
Africa, as an example, we saw an extension of almost a day in terms of their travel trips. And this was very consistent across many different locations. And think
Hmm.
about it, it makes sense, right? You can now work pretty much anywhere where you have a computer and an internet connection. And we're
Hmm.
also seeing a rise of the digital nomads, these people that are deciding to work in another location and spend a little time there on leisure, also on the weekends, et cetera. Countries are really accepting that very widely. I saw this in Portugal firsthand, and they have an open arm to have you come out and spend some time in Portugal, work here, and play here also.
Hmm.
The other big trend that I see is something that we're just going to be putting out shortly
Yeah.
is an amazing rise in luxury train travel.
Oh,
Yeah, I
wow.
mean, it's an area that we're starting to see much more improvement, and the growth rates on this are really quite robust. I mean, think about it. In the past, a riverboat was something that was very exciting to do.
Hmm.
You'd sail along the river and, see different towns every day. That's essentially what you're doing in a train, although I
Hmm.
don't have to worry about the level of the river waters to be able to move from place to place. Our research showed that those that travel on those luxury trains spend twice as much as others in local restaurants, in
Okay.
local hotels, and those types of things. So travel is really starting to rebound, but the elements of it are coming up a little bit different than what we've seen before. And that's really the power of our data, is to really allow us to see some of those insights before
Yeah.
anyone else.
It's going to be quite interesting to see those trends, particularly on the luxury train travel. It's quite interesting. I was having a conversation with my friends last week that luxury train travel actually used to be popular in South Africa years ago when I was in university, but it seemed that people had kept quiet about it, particularly with COVID-19, but maybe something to look into now for the future. Just lastly, as we wrap up the conversation, Wayne, of course, you are in digital payments, and AI is a big topic in every industry. Just talk to me about how AI is shaping the landscape of the global payments network.
Sure. It's funny. I can't even do an economic presentation without a question on AI.
Yeah.
It's like forecasting the weather and not talking about the sun. It's amazing how much this has become such widespread in terms of discussion. So we analyzed it. And what our latest data shows, if I look at the top 10 applications that are being used right now, they're primarily being used by either the largest firms or the smallest firms. Let's talk about both.
Mm.
On the larger firm side, we see what's been happening of, maybe it's a construction firm or a manufacturing firm, the use of robotics and image recognition. Those are very, very widely used. At the lower end, the small business, of course, the lifeblood of every country. And really what drives those economies is related to the small business sector. They don't have the money to be able to do their own large language models, but you know what they're doing is they're leveraging the tools that are available to them to increase their
Mm.
efficiency and their productivity. If I've got a four-person small business, I'm going to need somewhere along the line HR help. I can
Yeah.
now outsource that through Gen AI to get meaningful questions answered, as well as decisioning and the reasoning that these tools are now providing. So all of these are play importantly in terms of the health and the growth of those. The only thing additionally I would say is, this isn't going to happen overnight.
Yeah.
Businesses have to figure out new business processes to be able to use these tools, unlike what they've ever had to do before. And so we'll see a slower adoption rate based on the business, et cetera. But importantly, it's something that businesses need to pay attention to. And if they're not staying along the curve with this important technology, they're going to miss out in terms of things like what their competitive edge is going to be, productivity improvements, efficiency, et cetera.
All right. Well, we do have to wrap up the conversation there. Thank you so much for your time, Wayne, and hope that you enjoy the rest of your trip in Cape Town, even though it is quite busy with the G20. That was Wayne Best, Global Chief Economist for Visa.